What's up, coders and friends of Covalence? For today, I'm going to be running through an interview question we've had a couple students encounter, and that is rearranging items in an array with React, which simultaneously seems, oh, gross, that seems very difficult, and also, oh, that doesn't seem too bad. It's a little bit in the middle, so let's explore what exactly it takes. Now for this, I have some data. I have an array of album data of Frank Ocean's albums, big fan here, and I want to be able to rearrange it how I see fit in terms of album preference. So I have these buttons coded out on these little cards, and first and foremost, I kind of want to approach a little UI UX work where, well, if we look here at the very last item, I have a vote down button, and I feel like I really should not have one there. And the corollary is here on the very first one. I also have an upvote button there, but I shouldn't really be able to upvote something to infinity and downvote something to like negative infinity. So that's one thing I want to approach first as well. And that's just going to be a little bit of, React rendering logic, and then after that we can explore what exactly it takes to rearrange items in the array. So, hopping over to VS Code, I've just got a little create React app here with some bootstrap structure. Nothing like too terribly crazy, and I don't want to focus on like styling or anything too terribly much. I really just want to look at these buttons and what exactly they're doing. So I said that the index or the upvote button shouldn't appear on the very first album because you don't want to be able to upvote anything, to a negative index. And so we can kind of get some logic, flowing, thinking in that manner. Well, if we just think of everything with index positions, everything that should be upvotable will have an index of 1 or greater. So long as we do not have an index position of 0, then we should be able to have this vote up button appear. And so that is simply the check that we can do. We can do a little short circuit here. So I'll encapsulate this in curly braces so I can do this JavaScript expression and say index does not equal 0, and so in the event that the index position is not 0, this will evaluate to true and allow us to return this span with a button inside, and therefore it will only render when this condition is true. When the index position 0 is false, this short circuits and says, hey, I can't evaluate beyond this because this returns false immediately, so nothing gets returned out of this expression. So short circuiting, great for stuff like this. So if we take a look back at our application, well, now we have no vote up button on Blonde, which is a shame because I think that if there were an album that should get voted up beyond infinity, Blonde is probably a decent candidate for it. So outside of that, let's take a look from the opposite perspective. The very last item. Now, unfortunately, JavaScript doesn't have like an array.last property. Sure, you could probably like modify the array prototype for your own application to have that, but I really am not a fan of doing that just because it can kind of lead to unpredictable behaviors and kind of just inconsistencies. So we've got to do a little bit of the logic ourselves. But hey, it's actually not too bad. How do you determine what the last item in an array is? Well, arrays do have the length property, and that length is going to be 1 greater than the index positions because it's measuring the true length of the array, the amount of items in there. And so we can just take the length minus 1, and well, that gives us the index position of the array, or the last item in the array. So we can say array at index position, array.length minus 1. It sounds a little clunky, but it's not necessarily something that you should modify the entire array prototype to, have just a silly little length property. So yet again, we're going to do another little shortcut here. And we're going to say index, because we still need to measure the current index position, because that's how we know, which album card we're currently on. So we'll say index does not equal, and I guess since we're not looking for the item, we're just looking for the index position itself, we can just say album.length, or albums.length, excuse me, -1. So, this would be our index position if we were looking for that album in particular, but we're actually just looking for the index, so this is the index for us. So checks to see if it's the last item, and therefore, if it is not the last item, rather, it will be able to say, hey, this condition is true, we're not on the last album, we're on 1, 2, or 3, effectively speaking, or index positions 0, 1, 2, and therefore we will be able to return this downvote button, which I probably, should just have this not render at all, because I don't think any Frank Ocean album should be downvoted, maybe endless, but that's discussion for another day. So, the reason why I'm going over this too is because in at least one of those interviews, a student did have to do the conditional rendering of buttons. So this is just one such way that we could accomplish that pretty easily. And we also likely should have some kind of validation in our button handler functions just to ensure that when I click on a button, it goes through that same logic. So we'll still use those same indices, that same logic to figure that out. But now that we actually have those buttons, what can we do? So it's actually kind of pretty flexible. We're going to be using a lot of splice. And splice is going to let us remove an element from an array at a specific position. And we can also, with splice it returns the item you remove. So we can save that to a variable, and then we can reinsert that variable at a shifted index position by 1. So either up or down. So that's actually kind of the perfect candidate for moving stuff. But we have another conundrum. We can't directly mutate state. This leads to unpredictable behavior, React can't track changes, and we might not see the virtual DOM updating. So, how can we handle things in a safe manner? Well, we can make a temporary array that just takes a copy of our current state. And then just set state to that temporary array afterwards. That actually doesn't sound too bad. So, let's go look at one such solution. We can make a function that takes both up and down as its handler with, an extra secondary argument. But for now, I'm going to keep it simple for this video, and I'll make a distinct up and down button function. And so, say const handle upvote album. And I'm going to have this function receive the index position of the album we're trying to upvote. And I think I'm still writing TypeScript, whoops, but I am not. So I'll get rid of that. So ID is going to be the number of the ID that we just clicked on. So we'll click the button, we're going to invoke this function, and that ID gets sent here. Now I said what we want to do is create a temp array. And so, big fan of just creating a temporary array for a lot of data mutation challenges because, yet again, for dealing with React, we can't directly mutate state. If you are doing some other kind of like leet code style challenges or other interview challenges where you're just dealing with plain JavaScript or TypeScript, go nuts, mutate everything directly. If you've got scope of it, why not? But we are dealing with stuff in a Reactful manner here, so I need to, beat up this temp array and do all of my direct mutation to it. Then I can gracefully set albums to that directly manipulated temp array. So I said splice was going to be our friend in this condition because it lets us both extract something and remove it from an array, and then it also allows us to surgically insert something. So we know the index position. I said ID. Should have named that index. We know the index position of the item we're trying to remove and rearrange. So let's go do that. That variable name's okay. I'm pretty critical, especially when I'm doing videos of variable names, but I think spliced album is pretty appropriate for, what we're attempting to do. Maybe album to move would have been pretty okay, but, we'll see. So we've got our temp array, and we're going to call splice on that. Splice takes an index position of where we want to start removing an item, which, lo and behold, we have as our function argument here. There is a second argument of how many items to delete from this array, which is 1. So this is going to be mutative. It's actually going to change temp, and when it deletes that item from the array, it returns it into an array here. So I probably should array destructure this since I'm only removing one item. Otherwise, spliced album will be an array, and I would have to reference, spliced album at index position 0 elsewhere, which I think is kind of gross looking syntax. So after this line of code, let's say I decided to upvote channel orange. Well, we have albums with index position 0, 1, 2, 3. I click vote up. That sends the index position of 1 over to that function, and we splice 1 out. This gets extracted and saved as spliced album, and it gets deleted from the temp array. So temp is currently 0, 1, and 2. It's just an array of 3 albums with this extracted on its own. And so now we can use splice again, but instead of using this delete operator, we can say delete 0 items, and instead we can use its third optional parameter, which is a reinsertion. So you can use splice to both remove and to reinsert, and you can even do that simultaneously. We can't quite do that in this instance because we don't have the stuff that we need to reinsert quite yet. So we can't do it in one step, but we can do it in 2. So I'm going to invoke temp.splice again, and the index position we're going to start at is not the index we sent in, because that would just reinsert the data at the same point we started at, and therefore temp would exactly equal albums right now. So what we actually need to do is, if we're moving it up, that means I want to have a lower index position. So I need to start at index -1. And if you think of an array, if you're starting here, if you want to move up in the array in terms of like ranking, I guess, you're going to a lower index position. So remove 1 from that position, and you go to the left. Delete count 0, because we actually don't want to delete anything, and the item to insert is spliced album. So whatever we extracted here, we place back here, just shift it up 1. And so now in that example, when I hit vote up, channel orange gets reinserted at index position 0, so blonde is at index position 1, nostalgia ultra 2, and list 3. And that is going to be the array that we have to set to state. So that's really not too terrible once we kind of work out that logic. So I'll invoke set albums, and I'll give it temp. And yet again, splice is mutative. So I altered temp with this. I don't have to say temp is equal to temp.splice. It's not returning anything here. It might return an empty array if you delete 0. Not exactly sure what it returns when you delete nothing. But it's going to alter it with the inserted album now, and therefore I can now successfully insert that. So this handle upvote album, that's only going to be passed to the onClick event listener for, well, the upvote buttons. And this really should only be found in the ones that are able to do upvotes, because we're doing this little short circuit check here. We could also integrate that inside of the function, which I said, might not be a bad idea. Just making sure you've got strong data, validation. And conveniently enough, I am using the index here. I've got it named as a variable, so my function argument and then the value that I need to pass it are, the exact same variable. So yay, Andrew, because I typically have pretty bad variable naming habits, and things just kind of worked out this way. So we could check for this here and say, and we'll kind of reverse the logic. Here we'll say, if the index does equal 0, return, because we don't want this function to execute if it's the first album. Just in case, return. Just in case, I don't know, somebody's like poking around in the DOM and trying to change, some state. They're trying to change index positions manually. Like client-side code is, directly mutatable by the client, so this isn't really something for security, but it does help like accidental stuff. So I still like to make sure that even if I have stuff conditionally rendered, I still have the conditions evaluated for in my function handlers. So now that we have that in place, we actually have the ability to upvote. So Nostalgia Ultra, we can hit vote up. And so we take our temp array, that was a copy of state previously, and we remove Nostalgia Ultra from that array. So we were left with blonde, then channel orange, then endless. And then we reinsert Nostalgia Ultra at its index position, which was 2 minus 1, which is index position 1 now. And it gives us this array, which we set to state. So we can now upvote that. And now that it's been moved up here, React is re-rendering upon each state change. We don't have the button here present anymore. And from here, it's pretty easy to work out the, reverse logic for handling downvotes, which is why, sometimes I'm like, hey, maybe, we should do this, but in a single consolidated function and just take a second argument for up or down. But basically the same thing. I'm just going to copy the on click and slap it here and change the function name to downvote, because all that we have to handle downvote album. Whoops. Because all we have to do is change the index position that we reinsert stuff on and change our logic check. So if index equals albums.length minus 1. So this checks to see if we are trying to downvote the last album, which that button shouldn't, be present, but just in case, we've got this quick evaluation happening anyway. And we're still going to extract out that specific album, but we are going to, instead of moving it to the left, move it to the right. So we add one instead of subtract one. Therefore, we actually have a working downvote. So if I vote endless up just so I can downvote all the way, ha ha ha. But, we've got the ability to do that now. Now I can, I guess these album rankings, kind of vary on my mood, but we'll hold it as this for now. But we have the ability to successfully, move everything. Now, if we wanted to evaluate what it takes to consolidate everything into one singular function, well, we won't have the ability to quite do this check here. I guess we could. It might be a little convoluted, but we can see minus the check that all of the logic is the same except for the plus and minus, right? Well, what we could do is maybe just send +1 or -1 as the argument to a singular function. So let's create a function, a third one. We'll delete the other two, but we'll keep it the other two in place for now. We'll send an index position, and then we'll send a, I'll call this direction. Kind of like a vector, like an argument for like positive or negative. We're going to be sending a +1 or a -1, basically. And so that's what we'll provide to temp.splice. So what we can do is just add direction to index. So if I try to upvote an album, it's going to try to add -1. If I try to downvote an album, it's just going to add +1. And so this keeps everything very dynamic, and we have just one function to maintain. So if I wanted to use it, I would say handle move album here, handle move album here. My second argument, if I want to upvote it to shift it to the left, is -1. My second argument, if I want to downvote it, move it to the right, is just +1. And that negative sign is literally the only difference between those two functions, save for the validation. So what if we still did want to use the validation? Just a little bonus creative flexing of our brain muscle thingies. So what we could do is evaluate the index position and the direction together and say, hey, well, if it's the last item in the array and direction is a +1, aka you're trying to super downvote, no, you can't do that. And we do the same thing as well for the top voted array item. If the index position is 0, and if you're trying to move it -1 positions, you're trying to like super upvote it, which no, you can't do that. So we can have both conditions evaluated for with just checking 2 conditions at the same time. So if the index position is currently 0, aka it's the head honcho of all those albums, and direction is equal to -1, return. We're not going to allow a super upvote to happen, and we'll do the same thing here. We're going to say if index is equal to the album's length -1 and direction is equal to 1. That's going to say, hey, it's the last album in the line and you're trying to shift it over to the right, don't kick it while it's down, let it have its piece. Don't super downvote it into oblivion. So I know that it's not really possible with our conditions that we are evaluating here, but still, just if we wanted to flex those like brain organ thingies in our skull, there are some additional conditions we can evaluate here. So that's just about all we have for this. We've got an array that we map over, and we've got its index position accessible to us. So how can we alter that? Well, splice. We find the index position of the item we want to move. We take it out of a temporary array. We save that, extract it out of the array, and then we use splice to shift its index position by 1, either positive if we want to downvote it, or negative if we want to shift it to the left, aka upvote it. And we take that shifted index position and reinsert it into that temp array and set that back to state, which gives us our beautiful little Frank Ocean album sorter. So that's all we've got for today. But hey, if you liked this, go ahead and like and subscribe so you can see some more content, especially with some potential future React interview questions that we've had students encounter. So go ahead, like, subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next edition.